Welcome, everyone. This is Mike from RMI. We will be starting the webinar in about 2 minutes. Thanks. Okay, welcome everyone to the RMI podcast about the economics of electrifying buildings. We're really excited to share our findings, RMI webinar rather, to share our findings about this report that we did. So for the webinar, everyone will be on mute and you can submit questions in the questions window pane at any time during the presentation. We will save time at the end to address your questions. The webinar is being recorded and you will receive a link to the recording within 24 hours after it's done. And if you do have any technical difficulties, please shoot an email to Mark Silberg or just use the chat pane if you're able to, and let us know. Okay, so you may be familiar with RMI. We work to advance market-based solutions to transform global energy use and create a clean, prosperous, and secure future. On this webinar today, you'll have me, this is Mike Henshin, and Sherry will be speaking to share this report with you.
Hi there.
Okay, let's dive right in. So to start with, let's just take a look at the sources of greenhouse gas emissions in the United States. So from the most recent EPA data, we can see that about 9%, the yellow wedge in the bottom right there, comes from burning fossil fuels in buildings. These fuels are natural gas, propane, heating oil, and a few minor fuels. These are consumed primarily for heating space and heating water, with some used for cooking and other end uses. So we can see the breakdown here. Really, nationally, it is dominated by space heating. However, this varies significantly region to region and state to state. So where we see many states have now laid out goals to reduce their carbon emissions 80% or so by 2050. This 9% that comes from fuels consumed in buildings is a significant portion of that. And we argue that in order to reach 80% carbon reduction, this use of fuels in buildings has to be curtailed significantly. In northern and colder climates, it's highly dominated by space heating. In milder climates, it can be a little bit more of a mix, and water heating can be a higher share of that total. But the first message to note here is that for those states and cities that are seeking 80% carbon reduction, the progress in the electricity sector alone is insufficient to achieve nearly the scale of carbon reductions that they're seeking, as that's only 30% of the total. and that fuel use in buildings is of a comparable scale to that for passenger cars. And just as there's a lot of focus today on switching from gasoline to electric vehicles, there's a comparable opportunity in switching from fossil fuels in buildings to electricity powered by renewable sources. So that's our opportunity that we wanted to explore, that efficient buildings can power all end uses with low carbon electricity, eliminating fossil fuel use in buildings and the emissions that come with them. And furthermore, that these loads can be flexible and that the buildings can become grid interactive and help balance the grid and integrate wind and solar power, which have variable output. So this report, we set out to understand when and if electrification reduces or increases carbon emissions, and when or if it reduces or increases cost. So I think it's clear in theory that if electricity comes from renewable sources and electricity is used to heat buildings, then you have renewable heating and a low carbon heating sector. But we sought to better understand what are the immediate carbon impacts today with today's grid and today's technology, and what are the immediate cost impacts. So we chose 4 cities. We evaluated cost and carbon implications for space and water heating. There are a range of climates, rate structures, different generation technologies on those grids. We focused on single-family homes with central heating and air conditioning, comparing air source heat pumps to their fossil alternatives. Some things that we did not analyze were multifamily or commercial buildings, those with other heating systems that were not centrally ducted, and we did not assess ground source heat pumps or renewable gas technologies, but would be happy to field questions on those if folks have them.
Great, thanks, Mike. So we analyzed these costs and emissions across 34 different scenarios. As Mike mentioned, we looked at 4 geographies: Chicago, Oakland, Houston, and Providence. And in each of those geographies, we looked at both new construction homes and retrofit homes. The new construction homes are tightly sealed and rather efficient, and the retrofit homes are quite a bit leakier. We also compared standard flat electricity rates with time of use rates where those were available. In terms of appliances, for the fossil fuel scenarios, we compared replacing both a furnace and an air conditioner simultaneously, so looking at the capital costs of both of those devices, as well as if you were replacing solely a furnace. And in terms of fuel type, we looked at electric heat pumps, natural gas, propane, and heating oil, those last 2 specifically in Providence. And we looked at these for both space and water heating. Slide. Thank you. And just a few notes on the methodology. We modeled the heating, air conditioning, and water heating for a full year at 15-minute intervals for both scenarios. And we used Energy Plus to model the space heating and cooling demands. In terms of the carbon impacts, we used 2016 marginal electricity generation data provided by Watt Time for each of those different markets. The air source heat pumps modeled meet the NEEP cold climate specifications, so they do work under quite cold conditions. And in terms of the billing rates, we used the actual gas and electricity billing rates from local utilities in each geography, accepting the California 3-to-1 time of use rate, which is illustrative of a more dramatic time of use rate option. To give some high-level results, a big takeaway is that electrifying homes is cost-effective today in some scenarios, but is still more expensive for most existing natural gas customers. The most cost-effective scenarios include new construction, especially when you're considering the avoided cost of underground gas infrastructure. Additionally, customers using oil or propane who do not have gas service will find electrification cost effective. And natural gas customers who would otherwise replace an air conditioner and a furnace simultaneously will find electrification cost effective. Optimizing devices for time of use electric rates can significantly reduce the lifetime cost, but that depends on the rate design details and is not in itself enough to change the outcome between electricity, to change the overall outcome. And electrification already reduces carbon emissions with today's technology and today's electric grid in all but the most coal-heavy regions. Out of the cities that we looked at, that's Chicago. This is especially pronounced in a place like Rhode Island, where the grid is already relatively low carbon already. And now to look at those results in some detail, all of which can be found in the report if you'd like to take a closer look. This is the cost comparison of the scenarios that we looked at in Oakland specifically. So you'll see that we compared a standard heat pump on a default time of use rate, as well as a flexible heat pump on both the default time of use rate and a 301 illustrative time of use rate. These flexible heat pumps shift the load into times as without compromising comfort into times of lower cost energy. And we also compared natural gas with an existing AC as well as with a new AC. You can see that new construction is lower cost when electrified, even if you are not yet considering the gas infrastructure costs. And you can also see that the default time of use rate in California does not offer significant value for thermal demand flexibility because the price differential is too small. And as you can see, incumbent natural gas in retrofit existing buildings is a challenge to electrify cost effectively at this point. So, great. And then looking at the carbon emissions in these same scenarios, you can see that California's grid is already clean enough to see immediate carbon benefit from electrification. And given the high RPS, we can expect that much of the new generation to meet load growth will be renewable, and so that this carbon advantage will increase over time. And then lastly, a takeaway that we found across the board is that efficiency really does matter. As you would expect, the efficient buildings, which were the new construction buildings, have less than half of the emissions as older buildings, and that's due to the leakiness and general efficiency features of those homes. And then moving on to Houston, Texas, where again, we looked at a standard heat pump on a flat electric rate, and we also looked at the free nights rate in Houston, in which electricity is at a slightly higher cost during the day and is actually free during the nighttime hours. So we looked at a standard heat pump on that rate, as well as a flexible heat pump, which again tries to shift the load into those free nighttime hours. And we also looked at natural gas with both existing and new AC. You'll see that new construction is, again, lower cost if electrified, even when you're not considering those infrastructure costs. And that the free nights rate actually offers mixed results. You can see savings if you're looking solely at the water heater, but because of the climate of Houston, the air conditioning cost will actually increase in a free night scenario as the daytime load. And then you can also see that incumbent natural gas in existing buildings is again a challenge to electrify, and natural gas is more cost effective than standard heat pump in retrofit buildings at this time. And then looking at the carbon emissions, the Texas grid, like the California grid, is already clean enough to see immediate carbon benefit from electrification. And again, efficiency matters. The retrofit homes had significantly higher carbon emissions than the new construction homes. Because of the overheating in the free night scenario during the nighttime hours to allow for a lower load during the daytime hours. That excessive overnight energy drives the higher emissions that you can see in the flexible free night scenarios.
Okay, thanks, Sherry. I'm going to take this time to answer a couple of the questions that have come up. So one of them asks about the inclusion of cooling. And so, yes, to clarify, as Sherry was mentioning, air conditioning is included in the energy costs here. And now it's not that air conditioning itself needs to electrify. It's already an electrified end use. However, because the heat pump device provides both heating and air conditioning, we consider the entire year's worth of energy associated with both functions from that device. So that was one question. A second one was around controlled or grid interactive water heating. And we absolutely do. And that's one, actually, the grid interactivity, we're going to take a detour right now and talk a little bit about that. We're going to do it in the context of the Houston example and look a little more closely at that. So in our case, the way we optimized for demand flexibility was to apply a time of use rate and attempt to optimize the devices for that rate. And so we can see here in these load profiles a couple examples of what that looks like. So what's on the screen now, this is the Houston scenario. This is January. So it is heating season, even though it's not very cold in Houston, it is heating season. And as Sherry mentioned, the rate provided by one of the retailers we've chosen to model is actually free from 9 p.m. to 6 a.m. and then is more expensive in the middle of the day. So on the top profile, you see the uncontrolled load. The blue is water heating, the red is space heating. As you might expect, the space heating loads tend to be higher during the night when the temperature is colder outside, and minimal during the day when the temperatures are mild. If we try to optimize that, the strategies we employ are to preheat the water. In this case, we've chosen a very high temperature set point because the electricity at night is literally free in this case. We've heated it to what's probably the maximum technically feasible with this type of technology, which is 165. And then we've heated the home itself an additional 5 degrees higher than normal in Fahrenheit. And so we see it creates a much higher load in the early mornings during this off-peak or free electricity period. And then there's a big cliff right at 6 a.m. when the price kicks in. A couple things we can take away from this. One is that the water heating, you can really eliminate the need for electricity usage for water heating for many hours into the day. It's almost eliminated entirely for the first 3 hours and is reduced up to 10 or 12 hours. Again, this is the average daily profile for the month of January. So the water heating, you really get 10 to 12 hours of value out of that preheating strategy. The space heating, less so. In this case, there's some reduction on average for up to 6 hours, but that varies day by day. And on again the winters in Houston not being very extreme, in a more cold climate, that would be reduced. So this is a retrofit building. It's not particularly efficient. You're still getting at least a little bit of value for 6 hours out of that preheating strategy for space. If we flip to the summer, so this is July now, and we're looking at an air conditioning scenario, you can see much higher use in this hot climate of energy for air conditioning. The top is uncontrolled again, and the bottom is trying to optimize. So once again, you see water heating is pretty effective, even though it's a smaller portion of the energy. You're getting 10 to 12 hours of energy reduction out of the water heating, and increasing your usage during the nighttime off-peak hours. However, on a hot day in Houston, the energy is really dominated by air conditioning. And you can see here there's only a few hours of benefit. Really, the energy starts to kick back in within that first hour on a hot July day in Houston, and by about 9 a.m., you've pretty much caught up, and so you're not actually getting any benefit into the evening hours. So I'd say one takeaway is that trying to preheat before, or pre-cool in this case, before 6 a.m. on a very hot day doesn't really get you a benefit into the afternoon hours for space cooling. However, it does get you some benefit for water heating, and this would be comparable for preheating in a cold climate. If we look at one more case, which would be the new and more efficient home, we can see first and foremost that the magnitude of the load shape declines drastically. The timing benefits of demand flexibility are similar. The water heater is providing 10 to 12 hours of benefits. The space heating or space cooling in this case is providing 4 to 5 hours of benefit for the newer and more efficient home. But still, by far the dominant effect is the effect of efficiency, more so than of demand flexibility, because it lowers the overall profile so much. And then even though here we're showing a warm climate in summer, the profile results are comparable for cold climates in winter. That efficiency is really the dominant use. Water heating is highly flexible. Space heating has a few hours of flexibility, but not the 10 to 12 hours of flexibility that you could expect from water heating. Okay, so now we'll move back into the other city results, and then we'll revisit some questions after that.
Great, thanks, Mike. So now moving over to Providence, Rhode Island. Here we compared a standard heat pump, natural gas with both existing and new AC, as well as heating oil and propane scenarios. As you can see, there's a low-hanging fruit opportunity to electrify oil and propane customers who don't have access to natural gas, and the savings there would be significant. You can also see that new construction is lower cost, again, even without considering the gas infrastructure costs. Additionally, the cold climate heat pump technology that we mentioned earlier helps. You don't need to use resistance heat all winter, and therefore the efficiency benefits are significant. And again, you can see that incumbent natural gas in existing and retrofit homes is a challenge to electrify cost effectively. Then moving over to the carbon emissions, you can see that heat pumps are significantly less carbon intensive than all of the other options, and that the New England grid is already clean enough to see major immediate carbon benefit from electrification as compared to natural gas, but obviously also as compared to heating oil and propane, as you can see. And again, efficiency really matters. The efficient buildings have about half the emissions as the older buildings in some scenarios. Great, and then moving over to Chicago, where we compared simply a standard heat pump compared to natural gas with existing AC and with new AC, you can see that new construction, again, is lower cost if electrified, even without considering the gas infrastructure costs. And as we mentioned for Providence, that cold climate heat pump technology helps. And again, the incumbent natural gas in those retrofit buildings is challenging to electrify. Then moving over to the carbon emissions, you can see that through this marginal carbon analysis, heat pumps appear to be significantly more carbon intensive than the natural gas option. And this is because the coal-dominated grid on the margin means that in this moment, electrification is immediately carbon increasing. We would expect that the carbon benefit over the device lifetime is possible if the coal retirement continues quickly. A full analysis of the future grid mix was out of scope for this report, but you can see in more detail in the full body of the report as well. We compare to average carbon emissions as well as a potential hypothetical future of what the long run marginal emissions might be. And you can see that electrification becomes much more carbon friendly, so to speak. And again, that point about efficiency holds true in Chicago as well. Great. So now just a little bit of an example around how, even when heat pumps are drawing power from an electric grid that is natural gas fired, they are still carbon reducing compared to burning natural gas in the home. So here we have in the first line a natural gas fired water heater with efficiency of about 62%. And you can see that it has just under 2,000 pounds of carbon dioxide annually. And an electric resistance heater has significantly more carbon emissions than that. But heat pump technology, which is what we were looking at, has a coefficient of performance that is greater than 1. So in this scenario, around 2.3. And that means that the emissions are significantly less because, well, it's not quite efficiency, but the way that for each unit of heat that the heat pump takes from outside, it's moving 2.3 units of heat into the water, and therefore the carbon dioxide emissions are significantly less. Of course, if it were a fully renewable grid, that carbon emission would reduce to 0. But as you can see, even in a natural gas fired grid, the carbon intensity of a heat pump is still significantly less than that of a natural gas fired water heater.
Okay, before moving to the next slide, I will address a couple of the questions we've seen pop up. And then if we're not addressing your question, we will try to get to it at the end. So one is about getting the heat pump water heater up to 165 degrees Fahrenheit. So, to be clear with this strategy of heating very high, 165 we believe is about the technical limit of the refrigerant to heat water that high. And a resistance water heater could also heat the water to that temperature. And of course, heat pump water heaters have resistance elements, so would be capable of using the resistance element to get to that temperature if needed. Now, heat pump water heaters, or heat pumps in general, they will lose efficiency as the water gets hot. So a heat pump water heater that may have a coefficient of performance of 3 at a normal temperature of 120 might have a coefficient of performance barely above 1 at 160 degrees or 165. So when you get to those extreme temperatures, there's not much benefit compared to a resistance water heater. And we chose to go all the way that high to 165 in the Texas example because we wanted to see, sort of test the limits of free electricity at nighttime and just using, not worrying about efficiency of the device and just preheating as high as possible to optimize for cost. In the other city scenarios, we chose a more modest temperature around 150. And the other thing to keep in mind is that when water is heated that high, in order to keep customers and residents safe from scalding, you also need to install a thermostatic mixing valve. So at the water heater, the hot water is mixed with cold water and delivered to the customer at a safe temperature. Another question was about, does optimizing for the time of use rates incur some penalty or use more energy overall? And the answer is definitely yes. So this is one way that load flexibility with space and water heating is different from with electric vehicles. So with an electric vehicle, you may see that you're indifferent to whether you charge at 7 p.m. or 2 a.m. You don't use more energy to charge one time versus another. However, to preheat water, to preheat a home to a higher set point, you lose some efficiency and you use more energy overall. And so, for instance, in the California default time of use rate structure, we see that the price differences are just too mild to really get much benefit. You're incurring more energy overall, and you're not getting enough benefit from those price differences. And so that's why you need to see wider price differentials in order to really benefit from demand flexibility with these thermal loads. Okay, and then one other comment to recognize, that this finding about coal in Chicago may be counterintuitive, and we may say, well, there's nuclear power and there's wind power. The grid mix is actually more balanced in that part of the country. Our specific analysis used a short-term marginal approach in which we looked at every 15-minute increment through the year based on the ISO's data, what was the marginal generator, and that showed a very coal-dominant system. And so that's a very immediate or short-term approach to assessing this, which power plants would be dispatched more if load were higher. And we recognize that differs from what we might expect to happen in the long term from load growth. So if we expect that coal will continue to retire and that a mix of natural gas and wind will be developed to meet any new load growth from electrification, then you would see a much more favorable result. And so to be clear, that's very dependent on the approach to that analysis. Okay, we'll run through a few more slides and then we'll return to the questions. So just a little expansion on demand flexibility. So there's many services we could consider valuable in demand flexibility. We've categorized them here. Load shedding is really the traditional demand response that curtails an air conditioner or some other load during peak period, maybe lets the home get warmer in the summer and maybe less comfortable. Load shifting, which is the approach we've taken, which would try to preheat or pre-cool the space or the water in advance of the peak period, or additional services which are possible but which we did not include in this valuation. So ancillary services that may include frequency regulation, a fast frequency response, contingency reserve, or others. These are technically feasible. They're used in some parts of the country for resistance water heaters, are a little bit less applicable for heat pump water heaters, but not impossible. And then localized grid support, which you could imagine but is not yet widely deployed for managing voltage, actually building load during midday to increase hosting capacity for local solar, managing peak on a specific circuit as a non-wires alternatives project. These are options, and these types of loads could be could earn additional value streams for this, but it's limited to date, and those were not included in our analysis.
Great. So now to demonstrate that load shifting, here's an example from Hawaii of how a flexible heat pump water excuse me, how a flexible heat pump water heater can shift the majority of energy use to the midday period where there is a lot of solar. So as you can see, the on-peak period with an average daily load of a standard heat pump water heater, 25% of the energy consumption is happening during that on-peak time. But if you have a flexible heat pump where you're trying to shift that load out of the on-peak period and into the midday period with that superheating that we were mentioning before, you can bring that down to actually only 6% of the energy consumption happening in that on peak period, with much more of it shifting towards the midday section.
Great. So one other specific case to look at here. So we wanted to explore is there an additional benefit if you combine distributed solar with electrification? So we've applied that here in the Oakland scenario, and we've, in this case, the answer is yes. So whereas if you just look at the left two bars for a retrofit, we saw that the customer just sticking with gas could be lower cost, lower lifetime cost than switching to a heat pump. However, if we combine that electrification with installing rooftop solar in this case, we see a different outcome. So it's very capital intensive. So there's an additional $15,000 in this case for installing rooftop solar. But the long-term energy cost reduction is substantial and outweighs that, and makes the solar plus electrification a winning strategy on cost overall. And this is in part because in California, with this rate structure and this solar resource, solar in general is less costly than the utility electric rates. And we're able to power those electric devices with lower cost energy from that solar. This is with the current time of use based net metering regime in California. And this also suggests that there's a business model, a business case opportunity for the solar installation companies to pair electrification with their solar offering. Because it's a value-added service, but also it increases the need in that household for solar panels to offset their electricity consumption. So this could be an opportunity for the solar companies to expand their business or upsell customers who are already looking to go solar. Okay, another aspect here is the cost of infrastructure. So it's a complex issue, and we're going to talk about a few angles to that. So what we've shown here is, again, that Oakland scenario, but we've added this orange bar, which is the cost, which represents the cost of expanding the gas distribution system to a household. Now, these costs vary widely. It's hard to say there's a one-size-fits-all cost. If a home is already on a street that has a gas main and just needs a new service, the small pipe that runs from the street into their home, it could be $1,000 or $2,000. It could be in that range. If a home is far from the gas pipeline infrastructure, it could easily be $20,000 or $30,000. We've chosen a median value from the data we could find here, which has an incremental cost of about $7,400, to show that cost, if considered, could even out these comparisons. Now, there's a few other aspects to this. So one question is there also an additional electric infrastructure cost, which is not shown here? And the answer is it depends. So examples of that could be for a home that does not already have a 200 amp electric service panel into their home. They may need to upgrade their panel, which can be $2,000 or $3,000 expense. Or if an entire neighborhood electrified and the feeder serving that neighborhood were not sized appropriately, that may need an upgrade. So it's possible there are additional electricity costs, and those are not shown here. But we'd argue that in general, we would expect that the additional cost of the gas infrastructure to be a substantial opportunity to avoid for homes that are either distant from the gas grid currently or for entirely new developments which can be built without gas connections at all. Okay, that takes us to the report makes 5 recommendations, and they're listed here. I'll add a little bit of commentary, and I'm happy to take questions. The first 2 are really about prioritizing what is relatively the low-hanging fruit. So first, buildings that use propane and heating oil. We saw above that they have greater cost and carbon benefits to electrify now as opposed to those served with natural gas. So there's an opportunity to prioritize these. This is especially applicable in the Northeast, where heating oil is still a very substantial fuel used for heating buildings, and in many rural areas around the country that are not connected to the gas system, where propane is the fuel of choice, and propane right now is relatively expensive, making electrification a lower cost option. Second is around the expansion of the gas distribution system. So we'd argue that in order to meet the carbon goals, such as 80% reduction in carbon emissions economy-wide, there needs to be a significant transition away from all fossil fuels for heating. And therefore, that investing in new gas distribution infrastructure today is an investment that's likely to become stranded within the time frame of the next few decades, when we need to switch to a lower carbon alternative. Treatments of the existing gas distribution infrastructure is a complicated and thorny issue, but at least we can avoid or slow down the construction of new gas infrastructure, which may become a stranded asset within the next couple of decades. And of course, as we saw in the results for new homes, especially just because of the fact that one heat pump can serve the functions of both a furnace and an air conditioner, there's an additional cost advantage of making new homes all electric. Third is to include demand flexibility, rate design, and energy efficiency together with electrification. As we saw in our results, the costs are much higher for less efficient buildings. There is real value from demand flexibility, but it has to be controlled appropriately or priced appropriately. The demand flexibility benefit is especially strong on water heaters. The efficiency benefit is especially strong on space heating and cooling. Along with number 3 comes replacing electric resistance technologies with heat pump technologies at the same time to mitigate the increases in electric peak demand. 4 is expand demand flexibility options for existing electric space and water heating. Much of this is resistant. There are already 50 million electric water heaters in this country, most of them electric resistance. They are highly flexible, and only about 1% are enrolled in any kind of demand flexibility today. So there's an easy opportunity, relatively easy opportunity, to make the existing devices flexible. And lastly, to update energy efficiency standards and goals so that they reflect either total energy across fuels or are based on emissions reductions. So any standard today that penalizes a utility for increasing kilowatt hours consumed may be a disincentive to electrification, even if that would be beneficial to the system. All right, we have one more slide here about some of the opposing views or alternate views we've heard, and you may have some of these as well. I'll characterize them as 3. First, from the gas industry, particularly the recent AGA report, which argues that electrification is too expensive for too little greenhouse gas benefit. They've applied the number of $500 to $800 per ton of CO2 averted. I would say that this analysis uses the most pessimistic assumptions and applies them across the board, and does double count some costs. And so therefore that cost estimate is higher than what the strategy we would recommend would result in. as an example of this, that analysis uses heat pumps that are not rated for cold climates nationwide. So even in New York and New England, you're using heat pumps that don't function well or at all below 20 degrees, 15 degrees, 10 degrees Fahrenheit, which is much more costly. I would say it does highlight the risks of using the wrong technology or insufficient efficiency or failing to manage the impacts to peak load. And I would also assert that gas efficiency alone, while gas efficiency and more efficient natural gas usage can reduce emissions, that is insufficient to reach the scale of carbon reductions needed for 80% goals. The second argument we've heard from some gas utilities is that use of renewable gas in the existing gas system is a better alternative than electrification, or at least for some customers. And there are renewable gas technologies that are feasible for this, but I would say they need some more research and study. The sources that come from biogas or landfills are an option, but are generally limited in scale and not sufficient to supplant the existing gas demand. Hydrogen may have some application, but it's unclear what infrastructure upgrades would be needed or what device changes or safety protocols would be needed to actually deliver hydrogen to residential customers, and requires significant further study. And synthetic natural gas is possible, but is an emerging technology and has unclear economics. So it's less clear that there's a strong and economical pathway with that technology as opposed to electrification. And then lastly, I'll acknowledge that we've heard from the ground source heat pump industry about the merits of that technology, that it is highly efficient in very cold climates. And that was not studied in this report. Historically, we understand that those have a much higher upfront capital cost, and they may not be cost effective for many customers, although new innovations are seeking to change that. And then lastly, I will point out that eLab Summit is coming up. We will be discussing electrification. This is a collaborative multi-stakeholder workshop held next month in New Mexico. We will be talking about electrification there, and if it's something you want to hear more about, you can contact me or Sherry. All right, with that, we will turn to the questions, and we're going to look through the set of questions here and pick some out to answer. Okay, yeah, so one question is about natural gas system leakage. Do we take it into account in cost and greenhouse gas calculations? Sherry, would you like to address that question about gas and methane leakage?
Sure. Though it's included in the body of the report, though not in these slides, in a couple scenarios, we do look at the additional carbon emissions that would come from the methane leakage. And you can see that in those scenarios, the carbon emissions of natural gas scenarios do increase significantly, especially, well, in comparison to all of the other scenarios. We also look at the natural gas leakage as included in the electricity systems that we're looking at as well in the locations that were not Chicago, which, as we mentioned at the margin, was heavily coal-fired. Mike, do you have anything you'd like to add there?
No, that's great. I'm going to move on to the next question so we can get to a few more. So one of them asked about cooking. Well, the specific question is if there's another RMI study about electrification of cooking. The answer is no, but I can say a few things about cooking. So I'm going to scroll back to one of the early slides. So here on the right-hand side, we do see the breakdown of fuel emissions. So we see that cooking and other cooking is the largest portion of that 13%. On the right, so it's not, in and of itself, it's not the largest contribution to the carbon footprints, but is very important in particular in that if we're advocating all electric buildings, especially converting older buildings to become all electric, we have to address the fact that there are people who enjoy cooking with natural gas, and that actually can be a big barrier to customer adoption of electric heating technology if they want to, if the goal is to make the home entirely electric. And I will say I recognize the preference that many people have, the emotional attachment they have to gas cooking. I believe electric induction cooking is a highly capable alternative for folks who really enjoy the amount of control they have in their heating as they cook on a stove, and it's equally capable. However, there's a large inertia and a perception that gas cooking is the best option, especially for higher end customers, and that will be a real barrier to customer adoption. And so increasing interest and excitement around induction cooking would be one strategy to increase customer interest. Okay, and excellent. So then there was another question here. Let's see. There are some questions about, tankless water heaters. I would say this study did not assess tankless water heaters. They can use less electricity or less energy overall over the course of a year. However, with the electrification of these end uses, the big concern that drives cost, or a big concern that drives cost, is their impact on peak demand in the electricity system, and the need to offset or shift or reduce that peak demand impact to avoid costly impacts. And so I would say that the fact that water heaters, especially those with larger tanks, are so flexible and can shift load so far in the day. We saw 10 to 12 hours earlier. It could be longer even with larger size tanks. That value of that demand flexibility in a highly renewable system and a highly variable system is likely to be large enough to make the water heaters with tanks more valuable to the energy system than tankless. But at the end of the day, if electric, either one could be powered by renewable sources. All right, we had a specific question about the square footage of the home. The answer is it's 2,401 square feet is the home. There are specific specifications about the efficiency of the building, both the new construction and retrofit scenarios that are in the appendix of that report. All right, so we'll return to the questions here. One is, have you looked at how a new time of use regime in Oakland comparable to Hawaii would affect the Oakland retrofit case? I would say yes to a point, and I'm going to go to the Oakland scenario here. So we did look at two time of use scenarios in Oakland. The default time of use, which most California customers will be on soon, where we showed that it was not a big advantage. And in fact, spending a few $100 extra on smart thermostats and enabling technology to make the devices flexible cost more than the customer would save. For the default time of use rate, where the price premium is only 10% or less in the winter and 20% in the summer, our alternate case was a 3-to-1 ratio of peak to off-peak pricing, where we did see nearly $1,000 in lifetime energy savings from dispatching the device differently. So it wasn't exactly like the Hawaii scenario, but similar, and showed results. All right, so we have a few other ones here. I'm sifting through the questions. There's a question about clothes drying, or comments about clothes drying. So that is one of the other uses of natural gas in the home, is in clothes drying. It's smaller, but not far behind cooking in terms of energy usage. And again, there is a new technology that's an alternative there that's all electric. The comment here suggests ultrasonic clothes dryer is an efficient electric technology. And that's right. So, similar to cooking, there's an older electric clothes drying technology, which is somewhat energy intensive. And then there's a newer one, in this case, ultrasonic drying, which I would compare conceptually to induction cooking as the newer technology that's starting to gain a foothold as an alternative to gas. All right, we have a specific question about the natural gas prices used. And those prices are the retail gas rates from the gas utilities in each city. The specific rate structure is available in the appendix in the report. It ranges, I believe, from 62 cents a therm in Texas up to somewhere well over $1 per therm. But those rates also differ in how much of a fixed charge they apply to the customer for access to the natural gas system. So one of the benefits we see in making the home all electric is that the customer can discontinue gas service altogether. In one of the states, it may have been California, I don't recall, there's a monthly fixed charge over $30 for access to the gas system, and that monthly charge goes away entirely when the home becomes fully electrified, and so that's an additional opportunity for savings. Yeah, again, another question about methane leakage rates and what's the accurate data. In our research, we found a variety of different reports with different conclusions. They are conflicting somewhat, and it's hard to say conclusively that any one is robust. And so we used a range of results, but generally in the 1% to 2% to 2.5% range for leakage throughout the entire system. And that's what we use. So we don't have access to anything that is any more definitive than that. All right, we have time maybe for one more question. Yeah, one comment here is about line losses. So we showed a slide where we assumed a constant 7% line loss. The participant here is noting that line losses are highly dependent on the loading of the specific circuit, the specific conductor, and they vary by time of day. And that actually by shifting load away from times of congestion, you also reduce line losses not only for that electric heating usage, but for other competing uses during that time of congestion. And so reducing those line losses is an additional benefit, was not explicitly valued here, but can make up for some of those other efficiency losses associated with preheating or pre-cooling. All right. Well, that about does it. We're out of time. Thank you all for joining the webinar. We appreciate your time, and please feel free to reach out to us with any questions you have for follow-up. Thanks.